Yeah, they upgraded.
Yeah. Only the best for you guys. Okay. All right, everyone, welcome back to Books and Bagels. As you probably already know, my name is Sandra. I'm the Office Manager with Graduate Studies. We also have Dr. Techlin here from Graduate Studies, who is our Associate Vice Provost, and Taz Clark, our Associate Director, is also here joining us. And our Director, Natalie, should be here very shortly. We welcome you to Books and Bagels on behalf of the Graduate Student Association. This is our 38th program. So, thank you guys. So if you're brand new to Books and Bagels is a 1-hour lunch program that we have basically featuring you guys, the students, to tell us what it is that you're working on and kind of discovering ways that you can work together, some of the similar challenges that you have faced, and kind of to just give you a more interdisciplinary perspective on graduate studies here at Drexel. So today we have two speakers. One, Tom Zylkin from LeBow College of Business is going to be up first. And we also have Jeff Kahn, who's from the Mechanical Engineering and Mechanics Department. Our moderator for today is Dr. Hsieh. She is an associate professor in the Mechanical Engineering and Mechanics Department. So she's going to be helping us get through. As you know, all questions will wait till the end. And let's get started. Thank you.
So thank you for this opportunity. So for those of you who may not know me, I'm Hsieh, and I always like to lead introduction to myself, as I am a roboticist. And I think there's actually multiple reasons that I thought was a great opportunity for me to be able, what a great chance for me to moderate one of these Books and Bagels. So first of all, I did my undergrad at Swarthmore. So reason number one for accepting this is I have a BA in economics as well as a BS in engineering. And then after Swarthmore, I did my PhD at Penn. My PhD was in mechanical engineering. However, I was predominantly in the brass laboratory, which was the general robotics and automation, sensing and perception lab at Penn. Reason number two for accepting this, Jeff Kahn and myself are both Swarthmore alums, so that was another big reason why I had to say yes. And then, of course, reason number three is the fact that because as a roboticist, robotics is inherent in the interdisciplinary field, so I had to say yes, so because I myself do interdisciplinary. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, which is Tom Zylkin from the College of School of Economics.
Thank you, Dr. Hsieh. That was a very nice introduction. So I'm Tom Zylkin. I'm going to talk to you about free trade agreements. These are the big picture. I'm a PhD student here at Drexel in economics. To some of you, that will mean a lot. Others maybe more have an idea of what that means. But where am I in this program? I enrolled back in fall 2009, so I'm a veteran of the struggle to get the PhD. I expect to defend this spring, so this is going to be my last year. And I'm going to be on the academic job market this year, so you know any openings. Jeff, you guys may be this Swarthmore. Yeah. But really what I want to focus on is my research. So I have two main strands for what I actually do, and I'd say they both fall under international political economy, which means economic study of politics and political decisions. So first of all, free trade agreements, which is what I'm going to talk about mostly, but also the economics of armed conflict. Why we raise armies, why we fight each other, international relations. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to communicate some things you'll find interesting about free trade agreements that you did not know before, or at least appreciate why what I do might be important to some. So, just give you a quick outline of what we're going to do today. First of all, I'm going to just tell you everything economists know about free trade agreements, which I will cover in one slide. I'll then explain how there's a lot of things we used to think we knew about free trade agreements that turned out to be wrong. And then I'll say, okay, here's how I have backed up and tried to fill in the gaps. And I also want to add, why it's actually important. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit more about me, so I can talk more about personal experiences, what it's like to be a PhD student in economics, and what it's been like, particularly for me and my travels. So, what do we currently know about free trade agreements? As I said in one slide, there are now more of them than ever before, so this is not something you should just think is not going on in the world or is not important. There's actually 354 counting currently in force, and that rate at which free trade agreements are being signed has only been increasing since the 1990s. Also, they matter a lot for the global economy. What I mean by that is that if you look at the average pair of countries that sign a free trade agreement, they experience an increase in trade directly of about 60%. So is that a big number, yes or no? Well, for the U.S., our trade is about 13.5% of GDP, and because the U.S. is a big country, that's not a trivial number at all. But especially for a smaller country like South Korea that's particularly dependent on trade, you can imagine that signing a free trade agreement like South Korea did recently with the EU is going to matter a great deal. As I said, one slide, empirically, this is all we can really solidly say about free trade agreements. They increase trade a lot, and they matter a lot. Why can't we say more? Well, let me talk about what we used to think we knew about free trade agreements. The old thinking was that FTAs primarily would increase trade by reducing what's called tariffs, direct taxes on trade that you have to pay in order to export goods to a different country. So let me just give you an example of what tariffs look like in NAFTA. So that's the free trade agreement the U.S. has with Mexico and Canada. Now, this table might be a little small. What I generally want to convey here is that if you look at this column labeled importer and look at what the tariffs are across all these different industries, this country, Mexico, tends to have the highest tariffs on all these different classes of goods. If you look at the top part of this table, the before NAFTA period. So what would you expect to happen based on Mexico having the highest tariffs? Well, you do expect that Mexico would also experience the largest increase in imports when they sign a free trade agreement. Is that what happened? Great leading question here. Answer, no. This leaves the trade literature at a bit of a loss because now we suddenly don't understand what it is free trade agreements are doing for trade. And this is where I hope to add a few things. So as I said, this is the truth. Oh, I wish that was large. This is a really good picture. Those pictures where you have a dog and a computer, it says, I don't know what we're doing. The truth is we don't know why FTAs promote trade to the extent that they do. FTAs have many provisions beyond tariffs that also have substantial impact on trade. Just to give you a couple examples, investment protection provisions, guarantees on your property rights as an investor if you were to buy a company in a foreign country. That is a big impact on trade. Also, product regulations, even things you might not think are important, like what you're allowed to call your product. There's a controversy in the UK right now because Italian ice cream makers can't call their ice cream in the UK. They have to call it gelato. And people believe this is actually affecting their sales. They want to compete more directly with UK ice cream producers. It's a silly thing, but this actually shows up in trade data, and you can think of all sorts of examples why this might be important for larger categories of products. So here's what I do specifically. I introduce some new methods for looking back at particular FTAs and trying to figure out, okay, what did they actually do for trade barriers? If it's not tariffs that affected things dramatically, then what can you actually say about what actually happened? So here's an example of what I find, again, just using NAFTA as my example. Small table, so I apologize. First of all, though, I find that NAFTA, if you look at this number right here, NAFTA increased trade more than other free trade agreements on average. That's actually a new fact. There hasn't been a whole lot of study on what particular FTAs do versus the average FTA. Second of all, I split it out based on how NAFTA may have affected exports and imports for each of the three countries in NAFTA. And I think most interestingly, in terms of what I'm trying to convey here today, is that if you look at which country had the largest increase in exports, it's Mexico, which was also the country that had the highest tariffs to begin with. And just take it on faith that this number is quantitatively very large. It implies something like a 70% reduction in trade barriers facing Mexico, much larger than you could possibly motivate talking about tariffs. So why is this actually important? I mean, I've talked a little bit about how FTAs matter for the global economy, about how we've had a lot of FTAs that have been signed since the 1990s. Why is that particularly important today? Let's talk about current events. So maybe you have, maybe you haven't heard about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP. It hasn't really been US just yet. It is a big deal in the EU, but you are going to hear a lot about it in 2015, which is when the debates in Congress are really going to hit home. Now, why do I say this is a big deal? Because this is going to involve 40% of the world's GDP just between the US and the EU, and it's going to cover a very wide range of issues. So this is going to impact the global economy in substantial ways, and we need to be able to understand, well, what it actually does. So, based on what I've told you so far, what do you guys think we know about what TTIP's going to do for trade? We know that it's going to increase trade. We don't know how, we don't know for what industries, we just have this general idea that it's going to increase trade. And I can say that this is particularly relevant for the case of TTIP because tariffs between the US and the EU are already zero at the beginning. Both sides clearly envision that there are substantial opportunities to increase trade that have nothing to do with tariffs. It's even been said that TTIP will have the most extensive collaboration on so-called non-tariff barriers of any free trade agreement to date. And accordingly, there's really no firm way to model most major issues. So a lot of economists are putting out projections of, how will TTIP affect jobs? There are organizations that are sort of going around the world and trying to answer people's concerns about, okay, how is TTIP going to affect your local economy? And the answer to that question is TTIP is definitely going to be a positive thing for the global economy by increasing trade. Increasing trade generally is a good thing. However, we really don't know specifically what it's going to do to specific groups within each society. So this means that the studies that have been done, which generally assume something like a 25% drop in trade barriers across the board, that's a really fuzzy assumption. That means these studies are subject to large biases. So I think what I can say is important about my research is that it just provides a useful light of looking back at past FTAs and coming up with a basis for comparison, which we can hopefully figure out what makes them different from one another and determine why they affected trade to the extent that they did. So that's sort of like the thrust of my main research. Let's just talk a little bit more about me, because you guys are my captive audience for the next 5 minutes. And I'll try and tell you what it's been like being an economics PhD student at Drexel. All right, so let's just go sort of year by year, right? When you first get here, you have no understanding what's really going to happen. First year, you got to be prepared for lots of math, which is fine if you like math. I was a math major in undergrad, so I was able to deal with this. The second year is definitely more math. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. But I think that it got a little more interesting because it's more specifically about your chosen field. So in my case, I got to really study international trade theory and international trade methods for empirical analysis. And then so the third year now is just sort of this steady, gradual progression to complete my dissertation. I just wrote one paper after another. It really wasn't that bad. No, that's not what happened at all. I don't know what it's like in other programs, but actually my experience is a lot more miserable than that. My third year basically was just one long panic attack because I didn't know what was research. Fourth year, the first time around, I wanted to do things that I thought were really interesting and really cool, but also were very hard, which is probably why other people hadn't done them, and I didn't know what to do, so I did. My fourth year, I took a step back and I focused on learning some new tools that weren't necessarily related to specific problems I was interested in, but just gave me a better background on how I could apply knowledge to gain more knowledge, if that makes sense. So now I'm actually doing lots and lots of research and having these great experiences. But I'm not trying to say that it's now easier now that I've gotten over the hill. Actually, it's harder than ever because now they actually, well, I don't want to say I know what I'm doing, but now that I have a better idea of what I'm actually doing, I suddenly have a lot of work to do, which is great, actually. I would say that's part of what makes it all worthwhile. Having research to do that's fun, chances to interact with other people. I'm particularly lucky to go to some great conferences. I think if I were to say there's one thing that the econ program at Drexel maybe suffers in comparison to other programs is that it's very small. I mean, that's a great thing in terms of class sizes, in terms of interaction with your advisors and professors, but you don't necessarily got a lot of interaction with other people in your peer group. So getting to go to lots of conferences has been great, especially now that I have solid research I can present. And I was also very lucky a couple months ago to go to the Nobel laureate meetings in economic sciences in Germany, which I know they have these same sort of meetings in other science disciplines, which you can apply for it, do so, just because it's just going to be you, maybe 8 to 10 Nobel laureates, and 500 other grad students just like you who are really interested, really engaged, and really fun to talk to. And then I would say the last thing is just the chance to share what you do with others, especially teaching. I definitely would not be here today if I hadn't taken intro Michael as a freshman and found it really interesting. So thanks to my professor. But I don't expect my students to remind me. Anyway, thank you.
Do questions?
Okay, so I'm going to introduce the next speaker while we're switching over. So the next speaker is Jeff Kahn from the Mechanical Engineering Department in College of Engineering.
Quick food break. Go ahead and get more. If there
Yeah, grab more. So today I'm going to talk to you about biologically inspired robotics, which is the field that I'm in, and I'm going to talk about my research to understand how fish use their fins to swim. And this has many implications both in biology and in engineering and in underwater tasks and goals. And I'll also talk a little bit about this as an interdisciplinary field and the different implications in each field, because I think it's really exciting research and there's a lot of opportunities and areas to work. So, just as a broad overview, as I said, I'm in biologically inspired robotics, which at its core and as it's developing is really about biologists and engineers working together. Those engineers could include mathematicians, they could include physicists, they could include people that just are mechanicians that like to build things and design things. But really it's about these groups working together to learn more about biological systems. And what do I mean when I say biological systems? I mean, really, we're looking at animals and these amazing behaviors that animals have and trying to figure out how they work on very basic levels. And so biologists have questions about how do animals move to achieve behaviors that they have, what kind of actuators do they have. I'm going to use this engineering term, kinematics, to describe the movement of bodies. Also the mechanical properties. What about an animal, for instance, the fish I'm going to talk about here? What about an animal's mechanics? So how flexible is it? How does it interact with the surrounding environment? All these are important questions to biologists and also important questions to engineers. And the point here that I want to drive home is that robots can be used as platforms for scientific inquiry. We don't just have to build robots to go autonomously into environments, to explore environments, but we can actually learn about nature and learn about animals and work directly with biologists to understand how these animals interact in their environments. So I'm going to talk about these three areas that my research looks at, which is what kind of sensors do we want to pay attention to in robots? What kind of mechanical properties do we want the robot to have? And what kinematics, or ways of moving, do we want to have if we want to put robots in complex environments? And so I'll give you a little bit of background because we're in a specific area. So this has broader implications for the study of biology in general. But what I'm going to talk about today is about fish. And so what we know about the sunfish, which is a representative type of fish, it's a bony fin fish that uses its fins to swim. Has many fins, and there are bones inside these fins, and it can control these bones individually. But they're all coupled together through this webbing, this flexible material that allows the fish to manipulate the water and drive the forces on its body. So they're really fascinating to study, and the structures that they create underwater are very complex. But this enables them to be really maneuverable in underwater environments in ways that we really can't maneuver with engineered systems underwater. So by taking a look at the fish, we hope to learn more about propulsion underwater. And as we started to work with biologists and studying propulsion, and this is before my time, this is in the research track that I'm in, we realized that for fish to be able to control forces around their bodies and to move these fins in such complex ways, they must be sensing in ways beyond just the center of their body. But we thought about it, and to really control a system well, you need to be able to have some feeling of what's going on in the system. So our first insight as engineers was to say, well, if the fish is doing such complex things with its fins, it's probably sensing within its fins. And so we worked with biologists at Harvard University to study fish in complex environments, and we found that they will actually use their fins to touch obstacles underwater. And so they'll touch and interact with things. You take away some of their senses, their ability, you put them in a dark room, they'll touch things more frequently. So we started to think about these not just as propulsors, but as sensors. And so we worked then further with neurobiologists at the University of Chicago who looked very closely at these fins and discovered that they have bending sensors. That they have bending sensors in their fins, and they can actually perturb them, and they can see the responses in the nerves themselves. And so this motivated the objective of my thesis work, which is to really understand how this has implications in robotics. So for me, I want to understand the use of distributed sensing in robotic fins, inspired by these animals, to control propulsion and understand touch. Let me motivate this problem just a little bit further. But I want you to imagine for a minute that you are going on a diving expedition, and you have to make some choices before you go on the diving expedition. And once you make those choices, you can't necessarily change what you go out with. And so you have to make a choice of any sensor you want to use that includes your vision, that includes your sense of touch, that includes your proprioception or orientation with the environment. You have to decide in advance. And this is not such a strange problem to think about, because it's exactly the problem we have to think about when we want to put robots in complex environments. And so we have to decide the sensors we want to use. We also have to decide, how should I move? Is there a particular type of swimming stroke that I should use through this dark, cluttered, complex environment? And how do I want my body to be structured? That's a choice that we can make with robots. And that's something that we can learn about with these platforms. And my point here is that once we have these things fixed in place, we can change the way in which we use them. And so all the behaviors that we have are learned. When you work with a robot, it's able to learn new things. You, as an inexperienced diver, can dive more to learn how to more effectively move around, what to pay attention to, what's important, and also the mechanical properties of your body. Should I swim around in a really stiff way or be very flexible with the current? These are the kind of things that people gain over time through learning. So the neat thing about bio-inspired robotics is we can take these problems and we can isolate them. We can study them using specific robotic platforms. So here in my research, I actually have two robots. One to study propulsion and how fish produce force using their fins and what we should be sensing when they're doing propulsion. And then touch. We have a much more simplified robot that enables us to look at the actual sensory data. So this is data over time. This is how much the fin bends through time. And we can look at this information on fins. And so we can actually figure out which sensors are important, which kinematics are important, and what mechanical properties we have to design in the system. So for the propulsive system, we start with the kinematics. So how should I move if I want to create force under the water? This is an important question for robots that need to move through these environments. What mechanical properties should I have? I can actually design my robot so I can change the stiffness of it between experimental trials, and I can look at the effects of how stiff should I be if I want to make this force on my body. And then lastly, what sensors should I pay attention to? And so the amazing thing with robots, unlike with a lot of these animals, with animals it's so difficult to instrument their bodies and so difficult to obtain nerve recordings. But with robots, we can put sensors in places that we're interested in. And we can put specific types of sensors. So I can look at the bending information in the fin. As an engineer, I can also look at the pressure distribution over the fin. This field is very mature in its ability to instrument and sense things. Whereas with biology, this is very complex and difficult. And so the other thing is we need to work with biologists. As I mentioned before, the learning process happens from looking at the animal and also looking at the robot. So the first thing that we do when studying propulsion is we look at what the fish is doing. And so for my research, I studied fish hovering underwater, and I tracked the way that they use their fins through time, and found that fish don't just use the same pattern over and over again. You or I may have a walking or a running gait, but what the fish is doing when it's hovering in place is actually more like balance. If you were to stand on top of a ball and try to balance, those type of movements that are asymmetric and that are not cyclic, like running is a cyclic movement. But for the fish, it needs to have all these different patterns that it executes when it swims through the water. So that's immediately different from the way that we're designing a lot of propulsors and engineered systems. So it's something we can think about. The other neat thing with the robots is we can transition from the biological system, tracking points along the fin, to the robotic system, where we actually then implement the same type of motions, same kinematics as the animal, and learn how these kinematics produce force. But here's something that I think is really interesting with robots that we can't necessarily do with the biology further, is that we can use the robotic platform that we have that's based on the fish, and do what the fish can do, but we can use it to learn new things beyond what animals are capable of. So I can take this thing that's inspired by the animal, able to achieve all these things in the animal, and here I actually have it executing a learning algorithm. So it's sitting in a tank, it's producing force, I'm measuring that force, and I have a desired goal that's different from what the animal wants to do. But I, as an engineer, as a designer, can specify, this is the type of force I want to produce, learn how to do it. This is well beyond what we're able to do with animals. I think it speaks such to the power of robots as these tools for inquiry into how these systems work. So that's about kinematics. I'm going to skip over mechanical properties because it's very detailed. As if this isn't detailed. But with sensors, we can actually look at, so if we're doing propulsion underwater, what's the thing that's important? I've been telling you about force, because force will move the body in a specific way. So if I want to make a specific force, I better be able to sense something about that force. Otherwise, I can't control it. If I'm moving my limbs around and I have no idea what force I'm making, I can't well control that force. So basically here, with these platforms, I can put sensors on the robot, and I can say which sensors give me the best measures of force, or give me the best prediction of force. And what we're able to conclude is that with these two bending and pressure sensors, we concluded that bending sensors actually give us more information about force than pressure sensors. Whereas engineers for a long time have been putting pressure sensors on underwater vehicles, we really should be looking at the bending information of these propulsors. And so this is a conclusive piece of information for when we're designing these complex propulsors. But what we found that was interesting and aligns with the biology is that you can't just use one sensor or a sensor in a single location. You need a distribution of sensors. You need to feel throughout the whole fin in order to really control and understand force. And so that was the neat result that we had from looking at these sensors. Okay. So I'll talk briefly about touch because we started to look at this too. What is the animal feeling when it's touching underwater? What do we need to pay attention to? So the first question we had was kinematics. And we realized that if we were going to make the fins do complex things underwater, we might not know what's going on when it comes to approach an object. So we simplified kinematics, and you can make these decisions with robots. You can say, I really only want to control this one degree of freedom, this one way of movement. So speed is what we look at here. Then we can look at different stiffnesses, because remember I said the fish can stiffen its fins by contracting its muscles. So we can change the stiffness of the underlying bones that we have in these robots. We also wanted to look at the effect of webbing. Here we can put on the same kinds of bending sensors that we looked at before. And then something that we can't do, again, I bring back to this point, we can do things with the robots we can't do with the animals. We can look at what touch sensing looks like in air versus what touch sensing looks like in water. I can't very well take this animal outside and with the same type of preparation to look at the sensor did in the same way. So what we found when we were first looking at this is, so what we found was that during this very, very simple, innocuous-looking movement, like this seems very straightforward, we found that as you're approaching an obstacle underwater, there's so much sensory information that's available. And as you start to speed up, this is basically bending information in the fin through time. So this fin is approaching an obstacle. As it moves through the water, it bends. And what we found was that moving even at slow speeds, you might bend more moving through water, pushing around fluid, than you do when you hit an obstacle. And so already it's a very challenging problem underwater to sense when you've come in contact with something. So this has important implications for people putting robots in underwater environments or flexible devices. And when you increase the speeds, you can see this fluidic loading, so just moving through the fluid itself will tend to increase the way the robot bends. We might not be able to easily tell when we've touched something underwater. And so we can then change the mechanical properties of the fins. And I'll go quickly through this, but basically here with this platform, we can make fins more stiff. And as we make them more stiff, it's easier and easier to tell when I've hit an object underwater. And so when you're an engineer designing these types of platforms, you need to consider how stiff to design. And And this is a very complex slide, but basically the point is that before, many engineers have designed systems and they look at one sensor and they say that one sensor is representative of everything that's going on. What we're learning with fins and fins in underwater environments is that there's a whole distribution of information. These are each of the sensory traces that are across the fin. And so basically what we find is that there's a lot of different pieces of information and that they change across the surface of the device. To really know what's going on, you have to sense throughout the whole robot, throughout the whole action curve of the fin. Let's save this one. But the point here that I want to make, and I hope I've driven home, is that biologically inspired robotics is really about interdisciplinary learning. It involves looking at the biological system directly, working with biologists to understand what's going on. And it also involves designing platforms and robots in thoughtful ways so you can actually investigate questions of how should I move when I'm underwater? What types of stiffnesses should I have? Should I have webbing? How should I sense in this very complex environment if I want to be able to control propulsion, or if I want to be able to touch things underwater? And really, if I want to be able to take a robot, put it in a complex new environment, and have it learn new behaviors, and be able to survive or carry out a task. And with my research, one of the conclusions that we're coming to is fin intrinsic sensing, this thing we see in fish, actually has some major implications for propulsion and touch underwater. And it's informative about the environment, kinematics, and mechanical properties of fins. And so, thanks to everyone in the labs that's contributed to this research. This is not just me. Thanks to everyone in Books and Bagels and to our funders. And thank you for your attention. Happy to take questions. Thanks.
So we'll thank our speakers one more time. And then we're going to open the floor for questions. So I'm going to stand up here. So we have some questions here.
I have a question for Jeff.
Yes.
So it seems to me that the purpose of this is to almost design these robots so that they can think for themselves. So that the purpose of, and correct me if I understood it wrong, is the purpose to have all the sensory information so that they can make decisions themselves?
Absolutely. And I think, yeah, they can teach us too about what type of sensory information is important. Because as we saw, engineers often think they know what to pay attention to, or what should I be measuring in the environment. But the robot can teach us, no, this type of measurement is actually more important. Maybe you should be sampling this if you really need it. So I think they're learning platforms. Yes, the robots learn, but I think us as scientists can learn about what's going on.
So what kind of applications do you see your research being used for in the future?
Well, I'm really excited about ones in underwater exploration and sampling. I think that we're starting to make very compliant robots underwater, and they have the potential to be able to sample biological systems, other animals, to figure out what's going on in coral reefs. I think that that's really interesting. There's a lot of military interest in this, but I think it really is an opportunity to further our knowledge about animals and how they survive, how they evolve, how they change in these environments that are very complex.
Do we have another question? Right here.
How much of an impact do you think regularizing sort of intellectual property laws between countries has had as part of trade agreements? Because it seems like there's a lot.
Yeah, so there's definitely a lot of discussion on that, particularly with regard to TTIP, and that's because it's just a current issue in trade in general. I think a broader issue with international property is actually through the WTO and trying to form this broader agreement on intellectual property that will protect international property, intellectual property holders in the first world. We're particularly worried about unlicensed generic products and pharmaceuticals obviously being sold in developing countries. I would say one of the reasons why this is being incorporated in TTIP is they're specifically trying to create this language, which they call literally WTO plus, which could then be taken to the WTO and say, this is how we do it in our agreement. We want that in all further agreements going forward. How does that affect trade? That's difficult to say, just because it's not this tax you pay on a traded good. So just as with tariffs, it's hard to really say, okay, if we plug this in, what do we get out? I do think it's really important though, and there are people who are studying it from, not so much from a trade perspective, but what does this mean for the welfare of people in developing countries?
Do we have another question?
Well, I also had a second question for Mr. Kahn. In your typical workflow for designing one of these systems, do you usually start with computer simulation, or do you go right to building something physically?
So we would love to start with a computer simulation, but most of these systems are so complex that we're just starting to understand how flexible structures behave underwater. And so a fin is a flexible structure. And so the physics of that is still being explored. We don't have great simulations. So in a lot of cases, we have to start with the animal, what's happening with its fins, study that, look at high-speed video in detail, and then build a robot, and then basically tune all the parameters until we get something that's a very close match. And then we look at hydrodynamics, or the way that the flow moves past the robot, the way the flow moves past the fish, and then we can say this is a good model of the underlying physics. So right now, robotics is really important for understanding what's going on here. We can't just jump into simulation in this field, at least.
More questions? Also, I have another question. So I think, Tom, you alluded to this when you sort of talked about your experience, right? So as those of us who do interdisciplinary...
Just a question for me.
It's actually for both of you, okay? So what do you think are some of the challenges, and I think this is what you talked about before here, right? In terms of actually being able to conduct the research that you're interested in conducting, and how this, what are some of the challenges that you face compared to taking into context the way you were trained, right? And sort of the work that you were interested in or you're sort of expecting.
First?
Go ahead.
So what I would say is very difficult doing graduate level research in economics is that, as I said, you spend your first 2 years doing math, and all that math is really meant to do is bring you up to speed with what's been done up until recent years. If you really want to get to the cutting edge of what people are doing now, you have to keep on exploring on your own and keep on seeing, okay, how has everything that I've learned in 2 years solid of math, how has that been extended in, say, the past 5 to 10 years by some of the smartest people in the world? So does that make it sound kind of challenging? I think that's what I did not really appreciate when I came my 3rd year. Instead, I said, okay, I'm ready, bring it on, let's solve this problem, this problem, this problem. And I just didn't have what it took at that point. I needed to just take a step back, continue learning, read lots of papers, do more math for sure. Just get out a pen and paper, figure out what other people had done in detail. See the structure, try and see past like the alphabet soup you get from all the algebra, and just say, okay, this does this in their model. This does this. I could potentially do this. I can apply this for this. I mean, that's when you really get to start doing economics research. And I think that takes at least 3 years, including the first 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, I identified actually so much with your slide because I think that it seems a necessary part of the process that you go into the weeds, so to speak. That you start out, and at least in my experience, you start out with an advisor that has a research program and an understanding of the material that is far beyond what you start with, and maybe a set of specific paths that they want you to try. But beyond that, you kind of have to figure out what those paths look like in a lot of detail. And so it means going through the literature. It means identifying things that you think you could implement, trying to implement them, realizing that they don't work, or realizing that one of your major assumptions you had was just entirely wrong. I think it's a process that you have to become more comfortable with, and it's still painful, I think, to grow in that way. But it's really rewarding when you start to see a way through a problem that you thought had no solution. That's what I think is so exciting about this, is we get a chance to do this as graduate students, to pick a problem that people might say, this seems totally intractable, or this seems unreasonable. Everyone else has failed in all these ways, but you can kind of look through the weeds and find that path that might work.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. Sometimes you read something that someone you know is incredibly smart. You read what they've done, and then you say, oh, but they could just do this. And then you realize that they don't have all the time in the world to do these things. They're already trying to do this, this, and this. So you do that. You make it in for yourself.
So just, very happy that you guys talked about this. And I guess the good and the bad news is it's the same. So it does not change because as you sort of move through this process, it is this continuous thing of you realize the fact that you still don't know a lot of things, right? And so you still have to get into the weeds in order to learn things. Questions? Other questions? So, questions for starts with Jeff this time, right? So, moving forward, right? So, what are the things that, I guess, as you're working on this project, right, what are some of the surprising results that you got? What are the things that you found surprising, or what are the things that you thought were going to be surprising, but ended up being sort of run-of-the-mill type of thing?
Think about that one for a second, but I remember we were putting all kinds of sensors on these fins and thinking that we needed so many of them. Our underlying idea was the fish has tons of sensors in its fins, so we must need tons of sensors. And I remember the first result that we found was we needed one bending sensor for this one type of swimming, and we could tell everything that was going on about the force. And that was very disappointing. But when we looked at it, but then it turned around to be that if you want to have really diverse behaviors, you need to have a lot of sensors. And that was sort of a deeper level of understanding, because I think a lot of people could have come to that first conclusion of, well, one sensor will tell you everything you need to know. And a lot of engineers do that. But then when we looked at it closer and said, well, what if you change the behavior a little bit? Well, you need more sensors to really know what's going on. So it was neat to be in that process and then to come to a new realization. Yeah.
So to pick up on what I think Jeff said, you have priors, you try and test those priors, you come up with some results, and then you think more deeply about those results. So you think more deeply about those results and you realize that they're not what you think they are. So this is exactly what happened with this project I showed you guys. I'm sure if you've taken any sort of like elementary microeconomics class, you have learned about comparative advantage, right? The idea that countries gain from trade, essentially because they have differences in productivity that allow them to gain from specializing in different activities, right? So the US might produce cars, and some other country might produce our stomachs, right? So this is exactly what I thought I was finding when I was looking at these differences in how NAFTA affected these three countries. I just said, okay, Mexico must have comparative advantage in this, the US must have comparative advantage in this. But then I had to think more deeply about it. And I realized that the model I was using, and this goes back to what I was saying about just really understanding the structure of what models do that you're running. I realized that the model I was using already controlled for these sort of considerations, such as comparative advantage explicitly. And then it was like, wow, so this is not comparative advantage. This is actually how much trade barriers fell between Mexico and the US. No one has realized this before. This is totally something that no one has actually looked at and said, hey, you know what? That's not what we expected. So I don't remember what the question was. This is sort of just my process of how I start out trying to test something that I think, okay, this might be interesting, came up with something that, okay, this is a result, and then realized, once I had a deeper understanding of what I was actually doing, how interesting that result was.
Yes.
I have a question for Jeff.
Yep.
Can you sell, or could you sell any of your stuff to like a robotic company? Like, are people interested in this?
So I know that people are definitely interested in commercial technologies for this type of stuff. There are people doing underwater manipulation because the oil industry is huge, and being able to repair things with robot arms is very big. There are new startups in that. Yes, I think that this stuff can be commercialized. I don't know about the intellectual property agreements between Drexel and these labs, so probably not for what I'm doing.
But you could start your own startup.
Yes, I think that there have been several people in robotics that have gone that direction.
Cool.
Yeah.
Probably everyone in here is going to be looking for a job, right? So you got your company right here.
That's what I'm saying. Like, you know, we'll talk.
Okay, so I was told that we should try and conclude into one. So I'm going to ask each of you guys for some concluding remarks, and then we'll close the discussion session for today.
So I just wanted to say that, I mean, I've left you guys with the impression that big things are going to happen in the world that are related to free trade agreements. I think a good note to end on would just be to say, there's obviously always things that are going on in the world that are important right now that we don't realize are important until many years after the fact. That's actually the whole history of my discipline. It's a history of many sciences, that we have theories and then we don't realize until we actually get the data and then we can test it that the theories were wrong. So the story of international trade theory dating back to comparative advantage, which is from the 19th century. We thought we knew why countries traded with each other. We got data many, many years later and realized our theories were wrong and had to be upgraded. So I totally expect 20 years from now when I'm talking to you guys again, right? Books and Bagels 2034. I totally expect I'll be able to say, hey, remember those slides I showed you about NAFTA? Well, here's what I didn't account for. Here's what we know now we didn't know then.
Yeah, and I guess I'll say more specific to my field. I think there's a great opportunity now in engineering and in biology, and a lot of these fields that are coming together and starting to realize that they have similar questions. And so I think the research landscape is really exciting because there's more public visibility for different disciplines, and there's more availability of courses and of all this knowledge that we have in different disciplines. And so it's been really amazing for me to work in bio-inspired robotics because I get to learn about nature, but at the same time I get to use all of these skills that I have in engineering, robotics, mathematics, and really start to appreciate the world in a deeper and a richer and more interesting way. And so I think that engineering does not have to just necessarily